Actually, I will mute everyone, and then Ron, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. So good evening, everyone. I was muted in the middle of that, so I'll start again. My name is Ron Reid. I'm your non-technical host for this evening. And I have the privilege of being a member of the Council of the Iona Committee and a member of the Resources Committee. I'm sure, like myself, all of you are looking forward very much to this third session with Craig Gardner. You're probably aware that he swapped sessions 2 and 3, so this session is on prodigal hospitality. So without further ado, can I hand over to Craig to lead us through this interesting topic?
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. Some years ago, I preached a sermon which I entitled The Prodigal Father. It was, of course, a take on the parable we usually refer to as the prodigal son. I suggested that if anyone in the story was using their resources with extravagant abandon, then it's the father with his vast depths of radical forgiveness and free expression of reckless grace. His decisions lie at the heart of being prodigal, this almost wasteful indulgence. And it's at the heart of the gospel too, a welcome home, a place at the table, a feast in celebration, an anticipation of the mended creation that breaks in upon our days from our promised future. There are good things that we do not deserve, but we nevertheless receive, and that is the heart of the prodigal hospitality of the gospel. Since then, I see the New York pastor Tim Keller has written a whole book on the same idea, and one of the most popular recent contemporary worship songs is entitled The Reckless Love of God. So maybe we're on to something. In that sermon, I used some examples from scripture that showed something of this seeming wastefulness of God, including the bread left over after the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000 men, along with the women and children. My mother listened online to that sermon. She was not impressed. She phoned. God was not wasteful. God plans things carefully and perfectly. God knew just how much of anything was needed at any given moment. Maybe her theology was formed in a post-war austerity when scarce resources were carefully measured out, and some element of needing to deserve what you got was probably imbibed. Maybe. But I wonder too if it was an understanding of God that had been formed in worship and perhaps at the communion table too. I grew up in the Presbyterian Church in the north of Ireland, and it gave me many blessings, but one of these was not regular Eucharistic celebration. We celebrated communion maybe 3 times a year, and my recollections may be flawed, but I seem to remember one of the church elders coming to talk to my mother in the weeks before communion. Dad usually absented himself with an urgent garden project. But having confirmed that my mother was in a proper state of faithfulness, the elder then issued her a token that would assure her subsequent access to the sacrament. It was a closed communion church who put great stock by Calvin's catechism schools of assessing correct belief and proper conduct. But it also ensured that only the right amount of bread, carefully prepared in miniature cubes, could be prepared, and thus minimal waste was guaranteed. I know other traditions have equally well and tightly managed portions of bread and wine. In the process, however, I wonder if an image of a parsimonious deity with limited grace and guarded welcome was also formed. Such a God feels far from Jesus and the abundant hospitality of, I have come that you might have life in all its fullness. And it makes a difference who and how we worship becomes what and who we believe in, and what we believe then becomes how we live. Communion shapes our character, as one author puts it, or lex orandi, lex credendi, and lex vivendi, as I'm sure they still stay down your street. How we pray shapes what we believe and how we then behave. But what if who and how we worshipped was shaped by different images and practices, particularly a more prodigal, profligate, abundant vision of communion? What if the abundant generosity of God was not constrained by tokens of established virtue, doctrinal certitude, or even proof of baptism? What if we, who are usually in some way the insiders and the hosts, discovered the presence of God in and through the wideness and the wildness of our hospitality? Particularly, what if we discovered this with those who are strange or strangers to us? How might an abundant communion, a Eucharist that is open-handed and open-hearted, shape our ethical practice of living hospitably in the world around us? How would that emerge, not just in the church's Eucharistic hospitality, but in our welcome to all those whom society might see as outsiders, strangers, threats? Henry Nouwen reminds us of this potential because he says, in a world full of strangers, estranged from their own past, culture, and country, from their neighbors, friends, and family, from their deepest selves and God, we witness a painful search for a hospitable place where life can be lived without fear and where community can be found. Perhaps we see glimpses of that prodigal community in Abraham and Sarah's welcome to the divine messengers at the Oaks of Mamre. Maybe with the widow of Zarephath sheltering Elijah and the abundance of provision there. Maybe in the relationship of Ruth and Naomi, or the breaking of bread in the village of Emmaus. Surely we see it in the many meals at which Jesus was both the guest and the host, and often enjoyed the role playing between the two, and where he shocked the religious people of his time by the choice of those who he would literally embrace. The theologian Letty Russell notes in her book, Just Hospitality, that in the biblical examples, there's almost always some unexpected realization of divine presence in the outsider. And from that flows some moment of advocacy for the marginalized and the oppressed. And from that experience, the scriptures then move to a mutual welcome where all are transformed by the encounter, and each involved takes new delight in the sharing of a guest and host relationship. And it's out of that celebration that a new community of justice and of peace emerges. Maybe you'll be having your own connections with scriptural examples, or maybe you're thinking of a more real life setting. I have found such hospitality in one contemporary setting. I remember some struggling students in South Africa preparing a meal for me, the unknown visitor from Britain, and them saving their portions of meat that week so that we could all share a stew together. It's Eleanor Crider who argues that communion shapes character, and I think she's right. What we do around the bread and wine, how we do it, who we do it with, shapes more widely what we believe and how we behave. That's why the book of Hebrews reminds us not to neglect hospitality to strangers, because in doing so, we might have been entertaining angels unawares. And such people, Letty Russell says, are not strangers to God, for God has already reached out to care for them. Yet they are strangers in the world who need to know that God cares through the witness of a church that practices a ministry of hospitality and of justice on their behalf. So what if our differences with these strangers was not the point at which we defined or downgraded them, but rather it was what Russell calls an emancipatory difference? Something about them that is not like us, something outside the insiders, something by which we might all encounter the presence of God in creation's rich diversity. Without these emancipatory differences, our shared epiphanies would be all the poorer. And that's why last week, when we considered Sabbath as a cathedral in time, we're reminded that it was in such moments that we are instructed to offer hospitality to the widow, the orphan, and the refugee, or to anyone who is different in other ways, because in God's sight, there is none who is other, no one who is outside. So Sabbath, and particularly perhaps our sharing of bread and wine, becomes a time when we learn to give and receive from such people of emancipatory difference. And we've all been them at one time or another. Here is when what we cannot learn in our own identity, familiarity, or strength is revealed by God to us as God inhabits our differences and our weaknesses. And I suspect we've all had little fragments of those kind of epiphanies in our lives. So for a short time, just in our breakout groups, I want us just to share some experience perhaps of what we might call prodigal hospitality. It could be an illustrative story from the scriptures. It could be a Eucharistic moment, or it could be some wider experience of prodigal hospitality and emancipatory difference. So just for about 12 minutes, let's share an experience of prodigal hospitality in our lives, whether it's from scripture, worship, wider life. Share our experiences of prodigal hospitality.
Okay. Craig,
Always fascinated to know what other people have been saying in their groups. If you want to type down some great revelations that you've had in the chat, then please do that, and we'll see if we can spot them as we go along. A couple of years ago, on Monday, Thursday, Meredith, my wife, and I had quite forgotten that if we wanted to go to communion in the evening, we needed a babysitter for our two kids. So what to do? The Monday service is not designed to be child friendly, and that's okay, but it was too late to make arrangements. We could have just stayed at home, but instead we decided we would go and bring the kids, along with as many sweets wrapped in non-rustling wrappers and items of silent distraction that we could muster. And as it happened, they were brilliant. And as we came to communion, uncharacteristically for Baptists, we were invited to approach the table to receive the bread and wine. Normally, it is brought to us. As Meredith and I prepared to go forward in managed childcare shifts, our daughter indicated that she too would like to participate. She had witnessed communion in the Abbey. She had shared in family group Eucharist in the past, and we thought she understood some of the spiritual significance, and we were pretty confident that the church in which we worshipped wouldn't worry too much about whether this was an appropriate action or not. And then our little brother wanted to come too. If she can go, I'm coming too. Now, I don't know, even to this day, whether it was because I just wanted to avoid a scene in the middle of this most somber of church occasions, or whether I intuitively sensed that he had connected with the worship, but I held out my hand and he took it and we went. When we got to the table, the minister gave me a quizzical look that said, "Is he just here to hold your hand, or does he desire to partake of the feast?" And I took a chance on the latter. And the minister, for whom I will forever have the utmost respect, nodded their agreement, knelt down to Ewan's height, broke off a piece of bread from the communal loaf, and then my 6-year-old boy took that piece of bread, said thank you, broke it, and offered half to me. Now, I know I'm his dad, so I may be sentimentally biased, but it was the most sacramental act I think I had ever experienced. Now, he hasn't always been so generous, of course not, and he can't explain transubstantiation, consubstantiation, or memorialist understandings of the Eucharist, but then again, neither can I. He doesn't have a settled theology of atonement, but then again, neither do I. And in some way, just a few short years of observation and Bible stories, if not full participation in communion, still, communion shaped his character. And I believe that it can do the same for us. How we share our table, any table and any meal, I suppose, but especially communion, shapes our approach to hospitality, whether we're sharing bread with the family, offering hospitality to neighbors, or if it is a bit more prodigal a welcome that we offer to those whose gender or age, whose wealth or sexuality or ethnicity or ability is different to ours. If last week we looked at Sabbath, how as a community of faith we need to resist the powers and principalities of timekeeping, then Eucharist becomes the catechism for our character of welcome, where we learn to perform God's radical hospitality in a world of many differences, where we first learn to resist the xenophobic powers that would have us fear or demonize strangers and otherness and diversity. Here is where difference becomes an emancipatory pathway into sharing. How we resist the principalities that would have us keep what we have and keep it only for ourselves. This is a challenge for every Christian. As Christine Pohl has argued, hospitality is not optional for Christians, nor is it limited to those who are specially gifted for it. It is instead a necessary practice in the community of faith. And it's not just coffee and a biscuit after church, nor is it always to be found in the industry that now bears its name, no matter how beleaguered it has been in recent days. It is wider and wilder, as Letty Russell says. Christian hospitality is the practice of God's welcome by reaching across difference to participate in God's actions, bringing justice and healing to a world in crisis. It happens in ritual symbol and in practical application around the table of bread and wine that remembers Christ's Last Supper, but it's also a sign of the coming feast of God's healed creation. And again, as Letty Russell notes, the guest list for that table is derived from the announcements of the Jubilee year and Pentecostal gifts of understanding and inclusion. It's the poor, the captive, the wounded, the oppressed, the hungry, the thirsty, the homeless, the naked, the sick and imprisoned. They are invited, and indeed, here's the thing, they might be the host. We've already seen that our world longs for justice and healing for all of us, because the fallen powers of avarice, often personified as mammon, compel our human hearts not only to keep what we already have, but to appropriate from others for ourselves the goods of others. We have seen in the past few weeks how these powers of greed arrive from the false narratives of scarcity, promulgated by what Walter Wink has called the domination system. These are pervasive powers, idolatrous forces that usurp the hospitable grace of Christ and twist the patterns of our lives to their own end. If, as G.K. Beale suggests, what people revere they resemble, either for ruin or restoration, then such powers remain the false gods, which humanity, including the church, may come to resemble, either through unwitting or deliberate reverence, unless they are named, masked, unmasked, engaged, and redeemed. And for the early church, we know that such resistance was practiced in what was called the catechumenate, an integrated approach to discipleship, mission, and worship that effectively rehearsed converts into the alternative values of the gospel. It was like the regular exercise regime undertaken by elite athletes, only here the worshiping community trained to perform their kingdom within the world at full stretch before God. And this regime of worship, including communion, formed converts into a new resisting worldview that took account of those microforces that assault people in forms like anger, jealousy, lust, and greed, labeled by the early churches as passions or demons. But they also handled the larger macro powers like legalism, nationalism, and discrimination. To fail to worship in this way now, in the Eucharist and in our wider worship, may be by default to offer continued devotion to those fallen powers. Because James K.A. Smith argues, we are liturgical animals. We are creatures who can't not worship, and we are fundamentally formed by our worship practices. And the reason our liturgies are so formative is precisely because it is these liturgies, whether they are Christian or secular, that shape what we love. And we are what we love. We cannot not worship, but the way in which we worship shapes what we love, and then we become what we love. Smith's conclusion that we are what we love means asking whether we love having at the heart of our worship a meal of bread and wine that often feels like a benediction upon those whose insider status has been verified by the gatekeepers of authority, or whether we love a ritual of prodigal hospitality, where we share an abundance of bread and wine and difference, coming as both host and guest to a liturgy that specifically shapes not only what we believe, but how we behave towards those powers and principalities of scarcity and fear. Now, of course, these are not the only choices for our Eucharistic understanding, but it does take us to another breakout conversation where we might ask, what do our experience of Eucharist say about what we love, about what we believe, and about how we behave? If we are inevitably liturgical animals, what do our experiences of worship and Eucharist in particular say about what we believe and how we behave? So we're going to have about another 12 minutes to chat through this. Just to remember that it's going to be in the chat. If we are inevitably liturgical animals, what do our experiences of worship and Eucharist in particular say about what we believe and how we then behave?
Oh, very good. There we go.
Good. So welcome back. And again, wondering what all the conversations have been. Whatever they have been, our experience of hospitality at communion is inevitably shaped by how we understand Jesus and the Passover from which our Eucharistic practice emerges. And that's why I want to take us back one more time to Walter Brueggemann and his analysis of the Exodus story, because it's there that Passover is first ordained. We've seen how Brueggemann has traced the story as a falsehood of scarcity under the fallen power of avarice, beginning in the time of Joseph, Pharaoh, and those years of famine. And he returns to his analysis again in another book called Journey to the Common Good. We know the plot already, anticipating the poor harvests. This empire of Egypt stockpiled their food reserves. Joseph seized control of the means of distribution. And what was an opportunity to be truly hospitable to the world around him instead became an increased environment of hostility to anyone who might pose a threat to his accumulated wealth. And it's that move away from hospitality to hostility, and then maybe back again, I want us to think about. It's what Letty Russell calls a deformation of hospitality. Somehow it has become deformed, much like the fallenness of the powers, created to be good, created to glorify God and serve humanity, but now turned in upon itself to self-seeking chaos, confusion, and competition. This is a deformed hospitality, and Pharaoh's deforming leads to an increased demand for food payment from the strangers that reduces the Israelites to poverty, eventually to slavery, and then the ultimate insults, the slaves are then made to build the very grain stores that retain the excess food. And ironically, of course, as Brueggemann has shown, it's Pharaoh in all this who is the most anxious. It is Pharaoh who is most fearful of losing what he has, because he's created an empire, much like its modern day corollaries, where too much is never enough. And that makes him increasingly hostile and less hospitable to strangers. And Brueggemann suggests that in the biblical counter-narrative, God not only initiates abundance in creation, but as we've seen previously, he goes on to liberate Israel from Pharaoh's manipulation of scarcity. Exodus then becomes a contest between the powers of scarcity and divine generosity. A struggle between hostility and hospitality, a conflict that we see continuing globally today, raged by the powers and principalities that manipulate the narratives around not only food, but water and healthcare and shelter and so much more. Such hostile powers contend that we cannot possibly feed every hungry child or house every refugee, and even if we could, we ought not to. But more prodigal hospitalities, campaign and volunteer, bring charity and struggle for justice that will see a welcome and a hunger satisfied. And it's in Jesus, who brings us life in all its abundance, that we see the fullness of God's unending generosity and the embodiment of true hospitality. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus feeds the hungry crowd, but the disciples remain initially rooted in a world of pragmatic efficiency and even hostile scarcity. Simply put, they say, there's not enough for all of them, make them go away. But Jesus, who inhabits this transformative generosity of God, shares out of heaven's abundance. In feeding the people, Mark notes that Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, broke it, gives it to the crowd. The same pattern of words that are echoed in the Eucharist. And Christ's presence in communion calls the church and communities such as ours into that abundant generosity too. Now, this is hard. It's difficult because we live in a world of limited resources, of capital appeals, pandemic austerity, food banks, hungry children. And as Emily Scott, the founder of Dinner Church in America, has so eloquently said, abundance is a secret hidden inside of scarcity. It lives tucked inside not enoughness, waiting to show you that God does not do math. Abundance is discovering God's provision right in the middle of your fret and worry. But it's hard to escape the narrative of scarcity and strangers. Henry Nouwen says, our hearts may desire to help others, but meanwhile we've surrounded ourselves with a wall of fear and hostile feelings, instinctively avoiding people and places where we might be reminded of our good intentions. But equally persistent is the notion that there is enough. There is enough if only we could share it better, shifting from an environment that is hostile to one that is prodigally hospitable. If Christians don't exercise such abundance, perhaps it's because we've failed to be rehearsed in this limitless generosity of God at the table of communion. Perhaps it's because we've failed to imagine how sharing with our neighbor, with a stranger, might recreate a better world. And as such, the church's learning to share bread and wine becomes a rehearsal of how our physical resources, along with our time, our energy, our justice, are shared with the world. Not, again, as hosts of the charity, but as guests of one another's emancipatory difference on a shared pilgrimage from hostility to hospitality. And if communion speaks to the church of the unconditional grace of God, then, as Brueggemann suggests, it needs to be understood less as a solely theological phenomenon and more about recognizing what it has to do with reordering the economy of the world. It's well illustrated by the story of the food pantry in San Francisco. Sarah Miles was a new Christian, and she quickly discovered that God was revealed not only in Eucharistic bread and wine, but whenever we share food with others, particularly with strangers. And over the objections of some of her fellow parishioners, she began a food pantry, or a food bank, we might call it, here in the sanctuary, in the center of the sanctuary, right by the altar, where they gave away tons of oranges and potatoes and cereal, around that same altar where she had first eaten the body of Christ. So maybe instead of food bank collections being pushed to the corner of the parish hall, they ought to be placed front and center amidst the bread and wine, a sacrament of prodigal abundance for all to witness, calling us to move from hostility to hospitality. It's Henry Nouwen who gives us that motif of hostes to hospes, the move from hostility, hostes, to hospitality. In his little book entitled Reaching Out, he notes how in our seeking spiritual maturity, we need first to reach out to ourselves, turning our loneliness into solitude. But having learned to befriend ourselves, then it is that we might create space for strangers, moving from a worldview of suspicion to one of welcome. This, he says, is our vocation, to convert hostility to hospitality. And such a move begins with us discovering our own interior hostility and fear, but it moves on towards creating new spaces of friendship. And in such spaces, a stranger is not so much converted to our side or into our community. That's often the subtext of much church hospitality. But rather, Nouwen says, they are simply offered a space where change, both theirs and ours, might well occur. Nouwen warns such hospitality is not a subtle invitation to adopt the lifestyle of the host, but the gift of a chance for the guest to find their own. And to do this well, Nouwen says we need both receptivity and confrontation. Receptivity is pretty obvious. It means inviting the stranger into our world on their terms, not on ours. Because as we've seen, any condition placed upon a welcome can easily lead to exploitation, and it risks deforming the invitation and giving in to control by the fallen powers. But the other side of hospitality is confrontation. Genuine reception must have confrontation too, because we are not called to be neutral nobodies. We are a community with convictions and boundaries. We have a rule we live by. We have working principles, and we do not apologize for their importance. We have a history that is ours, and we must own it, good and bad. It is our house. It is our home. We are there. See, an empty house can't be a hospitable house. But if we are already in our home, then it must be stated where we live with honest revelation. This is where we belong. This is how we believe. This is how we behave. And only then can we truly be hospitable and open to the transformation brought by strangers. Now, of course, all that happens only if we were at home in ourselves. If we haven't made that earlier move from loneliness to solitude, then our need for others love, others' approval, others' presence will often leave us uncomfortable in ourselves and leaves us clinging to the stranger rather than creating space for them to enjoy. Nouwen argues that the virtues of poverty over and against the fallen powers of greed and acquisition make for the best of hosts. Poverty makes the best of hosts. Now, he's not being naive about the injustices of economic deprivation, but rather he focuses on both the poverty of mind and poverty of heart. Without the poverty of mind, he says, without our own admission of failure to make sense of life, we can be so full of our own ideas that we simply cannot hear the voice of the stranger or of God. And that leads to hostility rather than hospitality. Similarly, if we do not have a poverty of heart, then any host is too full of prejudice and anxiety and worry to offer any room to a stranger, and that too can leave us hostile. Nouwen ends where we began a few weeks ago, in a theology of weakness. As we explore a maturing spirituality and a more engaged life seeking peace and justice, often we look for programs of formation or training to strengthen us. But rarely do these programs seem to teach us how to live in our weakness, how to relish our poverty, how to celebrate our self-emptying so that there might be room for others. Nouwen says they ought to, and insists that any move from hostility to hospitality must be rooted in our weakness. Our fulfillment, he says, is found in offering emptiness. Our usefulness is found in becoming useless, and our power is discovered in becoming powerless. Now, much of that, all of it, is counterintuitive. Maybe that's how we know it's kingdom stuff. But in our last breakout groups, I wonder if we could discuss how we have experienced any move from hostes to hospice, from hostility to hospitality. I wonder if we might imagine what current hostile environment we know of might be changed to one of hospitality. So we've got about 10 minutes or so, maybe 12 minutes in our little groups. And I wonder if we can just discuss if there is one current hostile environment in a place of, if you could change one current hostile environment into a place of prodigal hospitality, what would it be? And how would you go about making that change? One change from a current hostile into a place of hospitality. What would it be and how would it happen? So we've got about, I guess, 10, 12 minutes to finish that. So Aileen will guide us in our timekeeping, I'm sure. Thank you. Everyone safely gathered back? Do you think?
Fluffy, yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm rather pleased to see the time and see that my timings have worked out quite right. I want to finish this kind of reflection on hospitality, and before we come to our time of quiet, just with a poem from Walter Brueggemann. Not only is he a good theologian, but he's also a good poet. And this is a poem entitled On Generosity. On our own, we conclude there is not enough to go round. We are going to run short of money, of love, of grades, of publications, of sex, of beer, of members, of years, of life. We should seize the day, seize our goods, seize our neighbor's goods, because there is not enough to go around. And in the midst of our perceived deficit, you come. You come giving bread in the wilderness. You come giving children at the 11th hour. You come giving homes to exiles. You come giving futures to the shutdown. You come giving Easter joy to the dead. You come fleshed in Jesus. And we watch while the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor dance and sing. We watch, and we take food we did not grow, and live life we did not invent, and future that is gift and gift and gift, and families and neighbors who sustain us when we did not deserve it. It dawns on us, rather late than soon, that you give food in due season and open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. By your giving, break our cycles of imagined scarcity, override our presumed deficits, quiet our anxieties of lack, transform our perceptual field to see the abundance, mercy upon mercy, blessing upon blessing. Sink your generosity deep into our lives, that your muchness may expose our false lack, that endlessly receiving we might endlessly give, so that the world may be made Easter new, without greedy lack but only wonder, without coercive need but only love, without destructive greed but only praise, without aggression and invasiveness, all things Easter new, all around us, toward us and by us, all things Easter new. Finish your creation in wonder, love and praise. Amen.
Thank you, Craig, for that. For a community that holds hospitality at its center, I think you've given us a very great deal to think about what hospitality really means and our own parts in that hospitality. And I, for one, am certainly looking forward to your final session, your fourth session next Sunday, when you're talking about a polyphony of word and worship, and that sounds fascinating. We're going to move into a time of quiet now, a time of silence, as is the custom in the Abbey of a Sunday evening. And we'll be able to have about 10 minutes of silence, and we'll follow that with some prayers for the community.